Hey, deserving listeners, let's watch the trial.
Down a couple more sentences. It says, AH reports history of substance abuse, including an addiction to cocaine and liquor. CT client reports abstaining from cocaine for a couple years, but was unable to report exact dates. Do you see what?
Okay, so I've skipped way ahead to spare you the boring bits, but they're now asking for testimony from another nurse for Amber Heard. It's just so interesting how many professionals these rich and famous people have in their life. They have multiple nurses, multiple doctors that seem to be like their personal medical team, or a sort of group of nurses and doctors that serve an elite group of people. I think one of the doctors says that he only treats people with means. I can't remember exactly the term he used, but anyway, so they're asking the nurse, and the nurse is reading her notes and saying that Amber disclosed to the nurse, that she had previous addiction to cocaine and to alcohol, but she has, it sounds like, managed to be sober up until the point of this report.
Couple sentences later here, it says, client admits to history of anxiety, eating disorder, attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorder, codependence issues, and occasional insomnia. Do you see that sentence?
Interesting. So Amber told the nurse that she had a history of anxiety, bipolar, insomnia, ADHD, and did I say eating disorder? There's one more in there. Let's rewind that.
Sentences later here, it says, client admits to history of anxiety, eating disorder, attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorder, codependence issues, and occasional insomnia.
And codependent issues. Interesting. Well, I would say that shows a fair amount of insight from Amber Heard to be able to report that. It's interesting that none of that showed up in the MPI 2, or it snuck through in the 3.6 code type with the elevated K, slightly elevated K. I don't know. But she has a history, so you could argue she's recovered from all those things by the time she is in the relationship. She says she has a history of it. All right. So this is actually really common. I don't know, but many people who come into my office, and I've been practicing 25 years, so and for a good, I don't know, maybe 20 years-ish, a pretty good percentage of my clients are people with just general relationship issues. And because I don't really specialize in things like depression or panic disorder, I've certainly treated those things, but I tend to, for whatever reason, attract, maybe it's my marketing or word of mouth or something, but people tend to come to me that will have chronic relationship issues, and there can be a lot of different reasons for that. Often it's childhood trauma resulting in schemas that result in things like personality disorders and attachment disruption and attachment insecurity styles and reactivity. Or maybe I just always see that in people. People might come to me with problems with work, and I'll eventually start seeing evidence of these other issues that I tend to see in everyone. So maybe it's just a bias of mine, who knows. I've had many people who have come to me who will initially talk about anxiety or eating disorders or possibly even ADHD sometimes, and particularly bipolar, because they might have been diagnosed that, because you've heard me previously talk about how bizarrely people will confuse bipolar with borderline. I find that to just be a gross misunderstanding of both disorders that you would possibly misunderstand. I'll say it again. Mania is distinct. And if you don't, even hypomania is distinct. Like it is a thing in and of itself. And when you see it or you hear the reports of it, it's indistinguishable from anything else. And it doesn't look like anything else in the DSM. So, I mean, anyway, so bipolar and schizoaffective, that class of disorders can all have mania or mania-like symptoms. Bipolar or borderline, nothing to do with that. The only similarity is people having erratic moods. And I guess people would think that that's somehow related to bipolar, but there's a lot of reasons why people would have erratic moods, right? People being triggered. PTSD people sometimes have erratic moods. They'll, boom, triggered. upset, angry. Next day, they're fine. Erratic moods, but that's not mania. That's not bipolar. It's like, anyway, so I'll have people come to my office having been diagnosed with bipolar, and they'll have insomnia, they'll have all the issues that she presented. And then when we start to look at things, and I ask about childhood, I ask about their current relationships, I ask about their past relationships, I get a vibe for them when I'm talking to them. There's a certain spidey sense that it's not like magic or being a psychic. It's people with personality disorders, their issues are so palpable that even when they're just talking to you about something mundane, especially if you're in a relationship with them, there's a pain and a tension with them that they can't get away from because it's always present for them, because they're very scared and triggered almost constantly to some extent. And as someone that is open to them empathically, I'll start to feel their tension. And I won't necessarily register it consciously, but I'll pick up on it in a sense of feeling danger. It'll be a feeling of fight or flight, as if there's danger in the room when there's no real danger. Sometimes it's a reflection of their fear of me, or fear in general, or their hostility towards me because their intention with me, they want me to, this is people with borderline histrionic, or narcissism, or paranoid, or passive aggressive personality disorder, dependent personality disorder can sometimes feel this way too. They want desperately to be secure with me. They want me to take care of them, and they have this notion, this emerging notion that I might be a trustworthy individual that they can finally depend on. So I'll kind of pick up on that, but they also have this corresponding terror, this disorganized attachment of me, and thus there's an anger towards me, but not direct, because we're not fighting about anything, because there's nothing to fight about, because I don't generally say things that are fightable. So, or if I detect disagreement, it's fine. You don't have to agree with, we can just talk about something else, but especially in the beginning of therapy. So, and I don't want to give the impression that somehow I just let things go. I in the beginning of therapy, particularly with people I detect might be on the personality disorder spectrum, I have learned the hard way that there's no sense in confronting these individuals in the beginning in particular, because they can't tolerate it. So you can only do that after a long time of developing a relationship, and then you can actually start to do some minor work in that area, and you have to go slow. But anyway, so I will have people that will have that presentation. They'll eating disorder, anxiety, possibly ADHD, bipolar. And over time, I will learn that they have a personality disorder, maybe one of the ones I mentioned, and that they also had an eating disorder, because eating disorders and borderline and histrionic often are comorbid. And they were mistaken for bipolar in the past. People with borderline and histrionic have anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety. In fact, that's usually what brings people with borderline into a therapy office, is they'll identify it as anxiety. And it is anxiety, but it's not an anxiety disorder per se. Now, someone with borderline and histrionic could also have a diagnosable anxiety disorder, but typically when we look at how they get afraid, it's because they're being triggered by distance or signals of threat of abandonment or betrayal, often imagined threats, but they will also find that the ADHD wasn't actually a brain disorder of executive function, when in fact they've just their whole life been constantly triggered and terrified and preoccupied and hypervigilant about possibly being abused, but also possibly losing attachment figures or pleasing other people, and didn't have enough brain power to stay on task in school, or, I mean, not always, certainly people with borderline histrionic can be straight A students, but they will find themselves having anxiety, trouble concentrating. They'll go to a physician, and the physician will do a quick assessment, say, oh, you have ADHD, here's a stimulant. It's a pretty common story, because physicians, medical doctors, they're pumping out the patients. They've got 5 patients in an hour, and they don't really have a lot of time to get a full run-up of your entire symptomology, and stimulants I think are seen by medical providers as a pretty easy, low-risk medication to throw at people. So you would have an ADHD label applied to someone that didn't really have a full assessment, because given the presentation we've seen from Amber Heard, and who knows if any of it is correct, if someone like that came into my office and there were signs of ADHD, I would very quickly assume that in all likelihood it's not a brain disorder of executive function, but in fact the distractibility, the lack of staying on task, the memory problems are due to the whatever caused the eating disorder is also probably causing complex PTSD or even borderline histrionic or other personality disorders, and thus making her have a really hard time concentrating and having a really hard time staying on task. So now I wouldn't assume that. I would, do all the proper assessing over time. And then of course the insomnia makes total sense as well, because if you're hypervigilant and terrified, it's hard to sleep at night. And then I would also, after hearing all of the substance abuse in the past, I would also, once I started to see signs of borderline and histrionic, I would assume all of that, except for the eating disorder, could be subsumed underneath the borderline and histrionic labels. And by the way, if I had a client, I would just pick one, because, well, given what we've seen, I mean, definitely borderline. I think the histrionic diagnosis is, I think Dr. Curry, who knows, but I think Dr. Curry is basing that on her interpretation of Amber Heard trying to get attention through writing that piece in the paper, in the Washington Post, calling out Johnny Depp as an abuser and calling herself this angel of a victim and the poster child of the Me Too movement, and that there are other instances where she seems, if you interpret a certain way, lying to try to get attention. So, yeah. I guess that would justify, because that's not typically what borderline people will do. But I don't know. For me, I probably would really focus on the borderline and just assume that that's the majority of the issue, and whatever sort of histrionic issues would be addressed as I treated the borderline. Although I probably would keep it in mind in terms of not only corrective experiences and awareness around borderline schemas, but also schemas around histrionic, which is attention seeking and this false paradigm that a constant attention means safety, which of course isn't true. You don't need constant attention from random people in order to feel attuned to and safe with other people. There are more functional ways of seeking safety. So I guess that would be something, and that probably would play out. Actually, the more I think about it, given what we've heard, if it is true, and who knows, that it would, it'd be one of the interfering factors, which I've experienced before with histrionic people. They will come to me, not always, but given the way that Johnny Depp's team is painting her, there would be a pretty good chance that when she came in, someone like this came into my office, they would be really focused on trying to get me to see them as a victim or something. Because in order for therapy to work, we have to have a fair amount of, shall we say, mundane therapy sessions where not a lot of fireworks are going off, where we really get into how they think, how they feel, what they want, what are their needs, what do they think is going on in my mind, do they feel that they can trust me, going through some exposure therapy regarding their traumas growing up. And so to do that for a histrionic person, that might actually aggravate them, because it doesn't feel necessarily like I'm giving them a lot of attention. The sort of attention they're used to, where they, like a common presentation might be, and there's many different types of histrionic, but this one type would come into my office and sit down and be like, "Oh my God, you just wouldn't believe what week I had." And as we get into it 10 minutes in, I'm like, I get this sense like we're not really talking about anything of substance. Because of course someone with histrionic or borderline could have a crisis week for sure. And they often do, and there often are real crises. And so, I'll attune to that. But with histrionic people, they're just so in this rut of wanting, if there are this type of histrionic, this is big, show of trying to get attention, and it's this way of fake presenting so that I will give them the attention they need. But of course, that fakeness interferes with us having a real relationship. And there's a part of the histrionic individual that knows that it is fake. So whatever attention I do give and do pay to them, they kind of know it's not real because they're kind of manipulating me to do that. And thus, they're not really getting, but they're like, well, I'll never get real attention and love and attunement, so I'll get this fake version of it, and at least that'll get me by. But of course, it interferes with actual real attention. Anyway, so the eating disorder part, traumas lead to both histrionic, borderline, and eating disorders. When I first started learning about eating disorders, there would be talk about trauma, relational traumas, and abuse being associated with it at times, and you read these studies, there'd be like, people with eating disorders, 65%, I don't know what the percentage is, it's probably around there somewhere, will report having been abused growing up. And so you're like, oh, okay, so abuse, it can cause a lot of things. But there's a whole group of people with eating disorders that don't have abuse growing up. And certainly, it's just, I've talked about this before, it's hard to know because you're asking people for self-report. Do they know they were abused? Because, you could be abused at 18 months and not remember any of it, right? Abused, neglected at that time. So it's hard to know. And if someone does remember abuse, do they just misremember everything? Who knows? But all the people that I've treated with eating disorders, and there was a span of time in my practice when I specialized in that as well, and they all had massive amounts of abuse, not only in their childhood, but like throughout their life, teenage, early 20s. And often it was severe abuse. It was really hard for these individuals to begin healing because the level of their PTSD was so high that in order to do exposure therapy, in order to do healing work in therapy and have corrective experiences, they need to be able to tolerate the work. And in order to tolerate the work, you have to be somewhat stable and you have to somewhat trust in me, and you have to have emotional regulation skills yourself that you might have never developed. And so, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but my point is that all of this that I'm hearing right now is very consistent with someone that I would eventually diagnose with borderline and histrionic. And it wouldn't be uncommon for someone to be diagnosed with all those other things because the people they bump into earlier either have very short amount of time to assess and thus wouldn't apply borderline or histrionic and be much more likely to apply something like anxiety or bipolar. Also, there's a lot of people that don't know what borderline really is or histrionic. Also, there's a lot of people that don't like applying that label officially because it can follow people around and there's so much stupid stigma around it that even though they might think, it looks like borderline to me, but I don't know, I don't want to put that on their record. Let's put anxiety. That happens all the time. So who knows what was going on prior in terms of in the minds of the mental health people or the qualified diagnosticians who diagnosed her in the past. But it's a very common precursor to an eventual conceptualization of borderline and histrionic, what we just heard.
I don't recall specifics. As I stated earlier in the morning, I remember a general anxiety with many issues in her life.
What do you recall Ms. Hurd telling you about her codependence issues?
Oh, right. So she mentioned codependency. Now, I've done a whole deep dive. I did a lot of investigation into the word codependency because it is an absolute clinical word in the clinical world, in the research literature. But in the general public, it has drifted away from its original meaning to mean something completely different, arguably the opposite. So to codependency, in a nutshell, is what I call it a personality disorder because it's a distortion based on trauma that affects the way that you see everything, yourself, others, and is sort of impervious to outside data that contradicts it. It's the same with borderline histrionic. Like, just to put a fine point on that distinction between what is a personality disorder or what isn't. We've talked a lot about borderline. When you talk to someone with borderline and you say, earlier today when we had this conversation, I didn't actually mean to hurt your feelings. I said this thing and you misinterpreted it and then it hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry that happened, but I just want to tell you I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, and you really misinterpreted what I was saying in that moment. And that's very common for someone with borderline to do. Not on purpose. It's a disorder and they do it. But the person with borderline, you can say this to them over and over and over again, and they just won't believe you. Not all the time, but pre-insight, often in the situation, they will say, "Nah, you're lying. No, I know what was in your mind." And it's a distortion of perception. They can't listen to data. Data doesn't matter. It's how it feels to them. So with someone with codependency, it's the same thing. They feel as though their only worth, or it's a compulsion. It's like, you can either say it's their self-esteem is based on, or it's a compulsive act that just seems like, of course, this is what must be done. They need to have someone in their life that has a massive problem with their life, often like an addiction or a disorder, depression, something, a disability. They need to be taking care of that person, and that person can't get better, is the thing. So they will both be trying to help that person. If the person's an alcoholic, they'll be trying to get that person sober, but they don't want that person to actually be competent, because that strips them of their purpose and of their ability to compulsively take care of someone. That's codependency. The word codependency, derives from the addictions world, in which you had, they called, in the beginning of the addictions world, they were just concerned with alcoholics. They hadn't begun to recognize or subsume other substances like cocaine and heroin. So it was alcoholics. You had alcoholics, and then they would treat out the alcoholics, and they would get better. They would go home, and they would go right back to drinking, and they'd pull them out to rehab. They would treat them, they would get sober, everything's okay. A few months, they go home, they start drinking, and then say, wait, what's going on here? So they started looking at the family, and they would look at the spouse first. And what they found was that the spouse was some of the spouses were kind of involved in the alcoholism, so they called them the co-alcoholic, like a co-pilot. And they started to realize that there was a common profile to the individual who wanted the alcoholic to actually be drinking. It's in a nutshell. There's a lot more complicated than that. So they needed to treat not only the alcoholic, but the co-alcoholic. Well, then eventually they started to talk about other substances, chemical dependency. And so they would say that you had someone that was chemically dependent, and then you had the co-chemical dependent. I think that's the word. But then eventually they shortened it to dependent and codependent. So you see the tracking there? Yeah, the dependent person, because you didn't want to say alcoholic, you just want to say dependent on something. And then you have the codependent. That is the person who fits well. They're often an overfunctioner for the dependent person. They're often insulting, controlling, enmeshed, trying to help, but not really, enabling, berating, a part of the problem, a part of the system that causes the problem. And that's what codependency is. Society, for whatever weird reason, has confused codependency with dependence, meaning relational dependency. But remember, we were talking about substance dependency this whole time. And now we're talking, there's another word in the clinical field called dependent personality disorder, which is too dependent on someone. You don't believe you can do things on your own for various reasons I won't go into. I've done a whole deep dive on that as well. And there's a lot of literature on this. I've treated a lot of people with dependent personality disorder. It's a very common disorder, one that's often overlooked and hard to detect, and it's sneaky anyway. And so these people believe they cannot do things on their own, and it's, again, impervious to data from the outside. They just believe it to be true. And they depend on usually one person. So they can't go to the store without that person. They can't make an appointment with that person. They can't make any decision without that person basically telling them what to do. There's a lot of anger in these individuals that they will actually suppress. So some dependent people seem like the nicest people on the planet, like they would never do anything angry, but they're passive with their anger, and they can be extremely angry individuals. So the dependent person can sometimes have a codependent, but we're using the word dependency differently. It's the codependent comes from the co-alcoholic. So you have the co-alcoholic, if you will, that, has this compulsion to take care of someone with a problem. And you have the dependent person who is desperately having all these problems and needs someone to take care of them. So the codependent and the dependent person in the addictions world fit well together, and the codependent and the dependent personality disorder person, they fit well together. Are you confused? But anyway, So when I looked online at Codependents Anonymous, and they list all the signs that would qualify you as a codependent person, it's those two completely separate, different concepts smushed into one concept. Whenever you see online these lists of symptoms of codependency, they're often talking either about only dependent personality disorder, or they're mixing codependent personality disorder with co-alcoholism, or wanting to take overfunctioning is another word, that, needing a compulsion to overfunction for someone that is underfunctioning. So all that to say, she identified herself, Amber Heard, as someone who has codependent issues. Usually that will emerge when you are a child. You were parentified and forced to take care of someone else. I think Amber Heard has siblings. If her parents, and I didn't include this, but she talked about her parents not only being abusive physically, but also having a lot of drug and alcohol problems. I think she said amphetamine and opiates, just like and alcohol, eerily reminiscent of what she was going through with Johnny Depp, which we could see how that would fit together. So when you are a child and you see your family falling apart, you have a lot of different choices, but one of the choices that children will choose is to become kind of like the parent, or at least temporarily at times. And so it's your job to take care of your parents, or for your younger siblings, or even your pets, because your parents can't do so. And so what this does is this creates a constant anxiety in the child that they have to be 20 times older and more mature and more responsible and more competent, but they're not that competent, right? It's like, imagine being hired to be the president of the United States, and you have no idea. Tomorrow, you're president of the United States. Go for it. You probably wouldn't sleep very well at night. There's so much responsibility, and if you screw it up, horrible things are going to happen. Well, that's what it's like to take a 7-year-old and make them responsible for the whole family, even just for a moment, because both parents are passed out, and now the 7-year-old's like, well, there's a toddler. How are they going to make sure they get? It's overwhelming. So the anxiety sticks with the codependent person throughout their life. They're in a constant state of fear. But when you tell them they don't need to be afraid because they're no longer responsible, they're out of their family of origin, they're like, no, you don't get it. Yeah, because that's the personality disorder part of it. Anxious people that don't have a personality disorder will often respond to data. Like if they're on an airplane and they're terrified, or they're about to get on an airplane, and you say to them, well, that the chance of dying is like basically zero, the risk is basically zero. And, often, especially if they have a little bit of insight, we'll say something like, yeah, totally. But I just can't help it. I'm terrified. There's some ability to look at, but with codependency, personality disorder, you don't listen. You're like, okay, fine, but you don't understand. Like, if I don't keep my eye on the ball of the people I'm taking care of, horrible things are going to happen, because there's always something that could happen to whoever they're taking care of. Often the codependent person, it'll be a child or their partner. And there's always something that could happen. I mean, you can always come up with some catastrophe that could happen to your kids or to your partner. But anyway, so I'm guessing that that was her role in the family. And when you have that role, you have tremendous resentment about it as a human being for the rest of your life. You are angry, but you can't express the anger, because when you're 13 years old and the entire family is falling apart and you have to hold it together, you don't have time to be angry. So you actually suppress it, but it's there. And you have a lot of reasons to be angry about things. You have a lot of reasons to hate people around you, particularly people who have problems, particularly people who seem to be, flushing their life down the toilet, like Johnny Depp, someone who was using a lot of substances. And you will berate them. You're not a man. You're a terrible father. Well, that's interesting. The projection there, the transference between her parents of, seeing her parents as terrible parents, and then watching Johnny Depp look similar in terms of stumbling around. You're a terrible father. And this need not only to overfunction for him and overpower him, because without that, her whole self-worth and her whole ability to remain safe, because when we treat codependent people with the person suffering from the addiction, we need the codependent person to let go and they deserve to let go because it's not their job to be in charge of someone, because this person's use often is sometimes a passive aggression against this person. And the more I think about it, the more it does look like that between the two of them. We saw that scene where he pours that big glass of wine. He's like, screw you, I mean, I'm interpreting, but so when that person is in this role, there can be a lot of control and anger, not always. And I actually, in my deep dive, delineate between different types of codependence. And I'm trying to remember, there was a chameleon type, there was an accommodating type, and there's a controlling type. That's right. Wow, it just came to my head. It was a while ago. And so if Amber Heard is codependent, if the data is somewhat true, she would qualify as maybe all of them, because there were reports of her being a chameleon. That's also a borderline histrionic thing as well. One, because you don't have a sense of self for any of these personality disorders. Two, you're so desperate to meld with someone, you'll even unconsciously just be them, Anyway, so there's a chameleon type of codependent. But also the chameleon type of codependent will start drinking if this person is drinking. They'll start drinking with them as a way of trying to make them feel better for, that's them helping. Is like, okay, fine, I'll drink too. I'll enter your drug-filled world because that will let you off the hook. So they're trying to help by having the same problem. They will control and they will try to accommodate. They'll try to please. They'll be like, hey, So I think we've seen all three of those with her, which adds a whole new wrinkle to my conceptualization. I can't believe I didn't think of this before. But she was the one who identified. But she could have been following the layperson's misconception of codependency and has identified herself as being dependent. So let's see if we can find anything else out.
Okay. The next sentence says, client expressed concern to husband and Dr. Kipper that she's nervous about being alone while husband is working on movie set in London, and expressed she has difficulty dealing with feelings of insecurity and jealousy when not in the presence of her husband.
Wow. Yeah. So did Dr. Hughes take this in consideration? Because she's telling someone that she has a big problem with jealousy and a big problem with being separated from Johnny Depp when Johnny Depp is working, which is a huge red flag for borderline. Not always, at least is, preoccupation. So, it's totally normal to miss someone, right? And be jealous at times. But if you have a jealous problem, if you have excessive problems and anxiety or pain or worry or hypervigilance or something when you are separated, even for a short period of time from your attachment figure, then you're very likely looking at least a mild preoccupied attachment label, or severe, or even things like borderline or dependent personality disorder, that kind of thing. But again, this is her report. This is Amber's report to the nurse. This is not someone labeling her or talking about her. This is Amber Heard telling the nurse, this is me. This is what I have learned about myself from previous experience or previous therapy or something.
Growing up, several different Catholic schools, but they were always in the other, on the other side of town, in the wealthier part of town. And I grew up quite working class, and thankfully with, as long as I maintained an A average, I enjoyed the benefit of a scholarship, and I did that until I realized that I could take my GED and SATs early, and I did that and placed out of school and effectively left school at 16 years old, I believe.
All right, so we're learning about Amber Heard's childhood. She's talking about how her father painted houses and broke horses, and Amber Heard would help with the breaking of horses. She talked about how you couldn't show fear in that work. And she grew up just outside Austin, Texas, a small town. Her mom worked for the state. She has an older sister and a younger sister. And she is saying that she did, I don't know what they call it in Texas, but in Seattle we call it running start, where you can graduate from high school early by taking courses that are both for high school and for college. And that means that you can get a kind of a 2-year start often, graduating effectively from high school at the age 16. And then she did that on her own, it sounds like. And I don't know, but that does lend itself to the codependent personality disorder that I am hypothesizing might be a part of the picture. She herself told her nurse, who wrote it down in a note, that Amber Heard said that she suffered from codependency issues. We don't know what she means by that. There's a lot of there's two main definitions that the internet and the lay public will use for that. Sometimes it's actual codependency. Sometimes they're using it in error to be a synonym for dependency, which is a completely different issue. It sounds similar, but it's completely different. But I suspect it is codependency, real codependency, that she was talking about, because if we look at the behavior between her and Johnny Depp, that was indicative of codependent behavior, and that you would be attracted to someone who uses, you would be really wrapped up in their use, you would be really enmeshed with that individual and their substance abuse. You might resort to control and berating them to try to get them to stop, but at the same time putting them down so they need to drink in order to cope. That keeps the cycle going. Essentially, the codependent person gets all of their self-esteem and stability and safety, they think, when they're taking care of someone with a massive problem. This is all subconscious. So they're consciously saying, I'm trying to help that person, but subconsciously, they don't actually want that person to change at all. And so they will do things to undermine the addict's ability to recover and to have the self-esteem to start to recover. And so they'll just be completely enmeshed with that system. And this two-person, dependent person, dependent on substance, and the codependent really fit together well and create a pretty toxic stew that supports both their issues. And I was wondering if, given that her parents had substance abuse problems and were abusive, that she maybe had to take care of her younger sister, maybe had to take care of her parents. And if that happened, which I haven't seen any evidence of, these individuals will grow up very quick. They will become very competent very quickly. They'll sacrifice their childhood so that they can become the caregivers of their family. And sometimes these individuals will actually do things like this, where they'll graduate from school early, partially because they don't feel like they're the same age as people that they're going to school with, because they've been through so much themselves. Also, they really want to be in control of things. They don't like being told what to do. They want to be in control of things. And so getting out of high school as soon as you can is an important thing. Also, it's possible that she might have been trying to get out of the house, and the sooner she can grow up, the sooner she can get out of the house. I don't know.
And what did you do for work during those younger years?
I took any job that I could. I worked at my father's construction company, sometimes, just administrative stuff. It was a small company. But I answered phones, and I worked at a modeling agency that was also, offered photography classes, makeup classes, hair and makeup classes for.
So let's take note, because the way she's responding to these questions seems believable. There wouldn't be any reason for her to lie about this, but this is a good template to compare to as she starts to get into things that people think that she's lying about. Because in this moment, she's just answering the questions. The way that she's answering it, the facial expressions, not that we can tell if someone's lying by looking at body language, but we can look for certain clues as to whether or not someone is overthinking something or holding something back. And in this moment, there doesn't seem to be any signs of that.
Acting, modeling, or both.
Okay. And what if
And who knows, but if the Dr. Curry diagnosis of histrionic is at least somewhat accurate, it could be that she grew up without attention, and she learned in order to be safe, in order to get some attunement, she had to reach for attention by being very noticeable and demanding attention, which children will do when you don't give them enough attention. And then that gets locked in to one's neurons and their personality and their behavior, their automatic responses, the way they see the world. And one could imagine if you were blessed with the sort of face that lends itself to modeling, that you might actually learn, oh, I can actually get attention this way, maybe also acting. And it sounds like at an early age, she either knew that or intuited that or something, either just independent of histrionic, but if she did have histrionic, you could imagine that being a good source to get attention, because you equate attention with safety and security.
What charitable work did you do when you were still young?
It started off as a requirement for the school I went to, and then I liked it so much, I think, because it meant I wasn't at home, and it was important to me. It's just to...
Right. That was my assumption. I didn't think she was going to say that. I thought she was going to say something more self-aggrandizing. I don't know why I thought that. It's mean of me to think of her, but I thought she was going to say something like, it just warmed my heart. But I was thinking, I bet you anything you were just trying to get out of the house. I mean, I know enough about her childhood to know, like, and so she sounds like an overfunctioner. And overfunctioners, what people sometimes call type A or something, that's a whole other topic that I've debunked before, but, and all the research has, but that indicates that possibility that she was forced to grow up too fast. So if you have those skills, those sort of maturity skills, because like for me, I did not grow up too fast. My parents allowed me to be a child for a very long time. In fact, I mean, my parents were great, but I think I was a little bit spoiled growing up. Like, just one example, I had never done laundry until I moved to college, and I'm in the fraternity, and I'm looking at the washing machine because there's all these settings. I'm like, what do I do? And like one of my friends had to like show me how they separate the da-da-da-da. My mom did all that for all of us, all 6 of us. She did that. And you know, that's fine. I don't think it's spoiling. But the point is, just like for me, when I was her age, there's no way I would have thought to graduate from high school early. There's no way I would have been able to handle that or even organize myself to that. There's no way I would have been able to volunteer in various different organizations, charitable organizations, and make that work for myself. You know, I was just a kid hanging out with my friends and listening to music and, you know, concerned with kid stuff, 16-year-old stuff. So when you are forced to grow up fast, you hold yourself in a much more mature way because you've probably been mature and old seeming since you were 12 years old. And that gives you this skill. And you're like, I want to get out of the house. Well, who's going to say no to me doing charity work? It's not like I'm hanging out with my friends drinking. My parents have got to let me do charity work. You know, that would be cruel to not. And it's like win-win, you know. My parents get to feel like they have a good kid in the family, and I get to get out of the house. So good for her for being able to admit that.
Not spend time at home. And I really loved meeting people. So I worked at the soup kitchen every morning before school, during the school year, for about 4 years. I didn't go on weekends, but on weekends I would do various things, worked at children's.
Just imagine how horrible your life would have to be in order for a child to self-motivate to volunteer work for that many years. Now, I'm not saying that no kid will do that on their own, but we would hope that a child, 16, would be a little bit more selfish, you know, allow themselves to grow up a little bit more. Let the adults take care of that stuff, or at the very least do it sometimes, maybe at the prompting of adults or something. But for a child to need to get out of the house that badly and to do all those things, you know, so we could imagine she's getting self-esteem and also maybe in engaging in codependency. You know, there's these places that she's volunteering at might have allowed her to take care of other people and overfunction for other people and deny her own needs.
Like children's museums, typically, because they would work with younger volunteers, and mostly soup kitchens and things involving children. I worked at with deaf kids for a while. All
right, well, that does it for that episode. Interesting stuff. Until next time, take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.